Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Frel, your professor in research in social studies. Our topic is on the research variables. There is a famous saying that goes like this: change is the only thing that is constant in this world. So, by saying such, it only means that change is always present. And another saying is on success is dependent on effort, from a famous philosopher. Now, let's answer the question, what are variables? Variables are measurable characteristics that varies. So it may change from group to group, from person to person, or within one person over time. Variables can be in quantity, in intensity, in amount, or in type. But for research purposes, variables refers to the measurable characteristics, qualities, traits, or attributes of a particular individual, an object, or a situation being studied. Example: you are familiar with gender. Gender is a variable that can take two values, such as that of male and female. Another example is on marital status. It is also a variable because it can take on values of never married, single, married, divorced, or widowed. And another is variable may be a specific, that is, a situation specific. So for this topic, we have discussed, or we will be discussing, the 6 types of variables. The first is the independent variables. Next is the dependent variables, followed by the moderator variables, the intervening variables, the control variables, and the intravenous variables. Now let's discuss each variable one at a time. Let's start with the independent variable. So by the word itself, independent, meaning it is a variable that is not affected. This is the factor that is varied or manipulated in a research. It is also the assumed cause of a problem, also known as manipulated variable. In an experimental research, it is the condition that you change or the variable that the researcher controls. It is called independent variable because its value doesn't affected by other variables. And take note, class, there can be only one independent variable in an experiment. For example, if a scientist conducts an experiment to test the theory that a vitamin could extend a person's life expectancy, then let's see the independent variable. The independent variable in this example is the amount of the vitamin that is given to the subjects within the experiment. This is controlled by the experimenting scientist. Now let's proceed with the dependent variable. This is a factor in research that is measured or observed. The change that is brought about or is affected by the change in the independent variable. So in short, dependent variable is the assumed effect of another variable, or it is the outcome variables and the variables for which we calculate statistics. It is the variable that changes on account of independent variable, or it is the variable which is influenced or affected by your independent variable. For example, if a scientist conducts an experiment to test the theory that a vitamin could extend a person's life expectancy, then the dependent variable or the variable being affected by the independent variable is the lifespan. Now let's compare the two variables, or let's determine the relationship between your independent variables and the dependent variable. So as you can see on the slide, the independent variable is the presumed cause in your research, while the dependent variable is the presumed effect. Your IV is the stimulus in your problem, while the DV is the response to that stimulus. And another thing is the IV is the predicted from, and your DV is the predicted to. And last, the independent variable is the variable which is being manipulated by the researcher, while the dependent variable is the one that is measured in the outcome. So you have also there an illustration that the independent variable influences change in your dependent variable. And another illustration that your IV or the independent variables affects your dependent variable or variables. Now let's have an example. Imagine that a tutor asks 100 students to complete a math test. The tutor wants to know why some students perform better than others. While the tutor does not know the answer to this, she thinks that it might be because of two reasons. One, some students spend more time revising for their test. And two, some students are naturally more intelligent than others. As such, the tutor decides to investigate the effect of revision time and intelligence on the test performance of the 100 students. Question: what are the dependent and independent variables for this study? So in answer to that, the dependent variable is the test mark as measured from 0 to 100, reflecting the scores of the students, while the independent variables are the revision time or measured in hours, how many hours the students revise for the exam, and another is their intelligence as measured using their IQ scores. Okay, class, is that clear with you? Now let's proceed with the next variable, the moderator variable. So this is a variable that affects the relationship between the independent and the dependent variables by modifying the effect of the intervening variables. So, it is also sometimes called a special type of independent variable. So, the independent variable's relationship with the dependent variable may change under different conditions, particularly if there is the presence of a moderator variable. So, as if the moderator variable is a third party to those variables, that to some degree it might affect the relationship of the first party, that is your independent variable, and the second party, that is the dependent variable. For example, if A is the predictor and B is an outcome variable, then C is the moderating variable that affects the causal relationship of A and B. So, as illustrated in the slide, let's say you have as your variables, you have hours of study as the independent variable and your exam score as the dependent variable. Then the IQ of your respondents can be considered as a moderating variable. Okay, the next is the intervening variable. These are variables whose existence is inferred, but it can't be measured and manipulated. They are not directly observable, but it links the independent and the dependent variables. In effect, it helps explain the relationship between these two variables. Example, you have on the slide level of education and spending. So your level of education represents your IV and spending represents your DV. These two variables can be affected by income as the intervening variable. So if you will try to measure the relationship between the level of education and the spending of the people, you have to consider also their income, because it can be inferred that income, it can affect the relationship between these two variables. The next is the controlled variable. This is the factor that is kept constant or unchanged all throughout the experiment in order for the researcher to test the relative relationship of the independent and dependent variables. So there are many controlled variables in an experiment, and this controlled variable strongly influences experimental results, because these are variables that are not measured in a particular study must be held constant, neutralized or balanced, or eliminated, so they will not have a biasing effect on the other variables. Example, if you are testing to see how the amount of light received affects plant growth. So, 1. In plant growth experiment, water and fertilizer levels are held constant. Another example, in the ice cube experiment, one constant or controllable variable could be the size and shape of the cube. So, by keeping the ice cube sizes and shapes the same, it is easier to measure the differences between the cubes as they melt after shifting their positions, as they are all started out as the same size. Then the last is the extraneous variable. These are factors in the research environment which may have an effect on the dependent variables but which are not controlled. They are also called confounding variables. These variables are considered dangerous since they may damage the study's validity. Example, if you are testing the influence of temperature on plant growth, we want to make sure that soil type and amount of water that is given are constant. Otherwise, they are extraneous variables. Okay, class, so those are the different types of variables in your research. So please check your work text for that part in your research proposals under your chapter 2. Again, this is your professor saying thank you for watching and see you in the next video.